Hey, it's been a little bit, but I'm finally back to Fear and Loathing on the campaign trail. And also getting ready for the LNC meeting this coming up weekend. So, it's continuing in the very frenetic pace. And I learned a couple things. I had to look up some terms I didn't know before, one of which is gonzo journalism, which apparently Hunter is known as the first, first practitioner of that art, which is making no claim to objectivism and writing very personal accounts a lot, being very heavy on the first person, which certainly describes this book. Also, there was something very puzzling to me that I had to look up. It is, of course, we are in May, but there is a footnote that says, at this point, I was recovering from a severe case of Hutchinson's disease. For a period of 16 consecutive days, I fed myself intravenously, which, knowing him, I'm not sure what that means. But I looked up Hutchinson's disease because I was curious what it was, and it's like a genetic anomaly that causes people to look like really old when they're young. Like, if you ever seen those pictures of those kids, they're like 10 years old and they look like they're 80. So I think he's being facetious here that this campaign is aging him. Not sure. I don't know how many people would have picked up on that footnote, but I tend to like obsessively look things up. So he's describing Ohio. And just again, the very fast pace. And he mentions coming back from pre-dawn breakfast actually Nebraska, excuse me, it's Nebraska first and then they go on to Ohio. So in Nebraska, the Omaha Toddle House. What the heck is a toddle? But with a bunch of stars like Jack Nicholson, Goldie Hawn, Warren Beatty, and so forth. So that was interesting. And by hook or by crook, McGovern did end up winning Nebraska, though it looked close. But he talked about the tediousness of following around candidates. 18-hour days of going to some pre-dawn meeting to shake hands at some factory, then to shake hands at some slaughterhouse, then to do some boring breakfast, then to do some boring lunch. And he mentions, according to the political pros, there's no other way to get elected. Go out and meet the voters on their own turf. But then he mentions that, let's see here, George Wallace refused that tactic and campaigned like a rock star on the theory that one really big crowd is better than 40 small ones. And he was agonizing over a 5-page center spread he was supposed to be doing, profiling McGovern. And I'm still not sure after the reading this if this ever got done, but he said he was about to interview the candidate for the spread when McGovern and everyone suddenly decided that Nixon's decision to force a showdown with Hanoi made it imperative to fly back to Washington. And then, like, it seemed like it was in preparation for some big confrontation with Nixon, and then nothing happened. It went out with a whimper. And then, looks like maybe the next day, he says, later that day, George Wallace was shot at a rally in Maryland about 12 minutes away from my house. And we talked about this on the LP Time Capsule in quite some depth about the shooting of George Wallace. And then they move on to Ohio, where apparently there was some funny business going on with Hubert Humphrey and lots of allegations of voter fraud. Go surprise. But like, there were instances where in heavily Humphrey areas, or, well, in areas where maybe they controlled the count, where the ballot counters would say, we're just going to take a 12-hour rest, which was against the law. And the suspicion was those 12 hours were to fabricate more votes. But I loved this line. It says, say, how many more votes do they have to count up there? And the answer was, as many as they need. Sounds like politics, doesn't it? And then McGovern's campaign manager was shrieking to the Ohio Secretary of State about, like this line, they were very careful not to use fraud, these fantastic irregularities. And everyone was predicting hell on the Miami convention floor, with no one coming in with enough delegates to secure the nomination cleanly. And everything was really neck and neck at that point, and they were going on to Indiana. And it's funny, earlier in this chapter, he's like, these late night Tuesdays are ruining my health. And then just like maybe 10 pages later, these goddamn Wednesday mornings are ruining my health. And apparently, Hunter ended up being somewhat of a liability in some sense to the McGovern campaign. He posted here, it says proposed photo caption. So I'm not sure if this actually went out or whether this was just like some humorous scenario he was painting in his head. But this proposed photo caption says, Senator George McGovern, shown here campaigning in Nebraska, where he has spent 23 hours a day for the past 6 days, denying charges by local Humphrey operatives that he favors the legalization of marijuana, pauses between denials to shake hands for photographers with his quote-unquote old friend, Hunter S. Thompson, the national correspondent for Rolling Stone and author of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, who was recently identified by Newsweek magazine as a vicious drunkard and known abuser of hard drugs. Okay. So, apparently there was a lot of dirty, or, smear campaigns going on. So it said that McGovern started having to lead now with angry denials that he favored either legalized grass or abortion on demand. And Hunter, when they were talking, Hunter said, well, I am for all of those things. I am for amnesty, acid, and abortion. And then he moved on to his profile of Hubert Humphrey with, I think it would be it'd be a gross understatement to say he did not like the man. So he says, with the possible exception of Nixon, Hubert Humphrey is the purest and most disgusting example of a political animal in American politics today. He has been going at it hammer and tong 25 hours a day since the end of World War II, just like Richard Nixon, who launched his own career as a red-baiting California congressman. About the same time, Hubert began making headlines as the red-baiting mayor of Minneapolis. They are both career anti-communists. Nixon's gig was financed from the start by big business and Humphrey's by big labor, and what both of them stand for today is the de facto triumph of a one-party system in American politics. And factions were starting to form. George Wallace was seeming to start to, this was before he got shot, throw his support to Humphrey, saying, my daughter has a big picture of Hubert Humphrey tacked up on the wall. And then the Kennedy clan were publicly getting behind McGovern. Now, after George Wallace got shot, people were really starting to speculate that since it seemed like perhaps he wasn't injured that badly, which turned out to be wrong, I think, that he would be back on the campaign trail within a month. And it says, Shano was the first one to speak the unspeakable, but a lot of us had already entertained the horrifying possibility that this country might be in for another wheelchair Democrat. The doctor was blithely predicting that Wallace might be going home inside of a week, which meant he might be on the loose again within a month. When he resumes campaigning, he's going to have a lot going for him. Increased coverage, or as one reporter was saying last night, Jesus, this is the biggest break that George has ever gotten. If Wallace loses the use of the lower half of his body, it will make him, in one fell swoop, less of a monster, thought that was amusing, and more of a superhuman, the only assassin's target of the last 10 years who has been blessed enough and strong enough to survive. But McGovern said that the Wallace shooting, well, a McGovern maybe supporter, insider, said that the Wallace shooting would actually help McGovern because it would increase people's feelings that they needed a quiet man. So going into convention, or at least looking forward to it, said as it stands now, Humphrey and Wallace between them will not have 1,000 delegates on the first ballot, and McGovern is a pretty good bet to go down to Miami with almost 1,300 delegates. So Hubert's only hope in California is a savage, all-out attack on McGovern, a desperate smear campaign focused on grass, amnesty, abortion, and even busing. And Hunter said, I've said a lot of foul things about Hubert, but I think I'd be genuinely surprised to see him crank up a vicious and groundless attack on an old friend. But his managers have already said they will try to do it with or without his approval. And that is the end of May. And they are heading now into the California primary. Oh, here's some of the titles for June. California, Traditional Politics with a Vengeance. Return of the Vincent Black Shadow. The Juggernaut roars on. McGovern troops ease off as polls predict sweeping victory. And then it says, ominous 11th hour slump reveals fistula in McGovern's woodpile. Graphic. Okay, well, I was just kind of looking ahead, but let's not cheat, so I will be back with June. We are halfway through our Fear and Loathing.